The Nintendo 64 was Nintendo's third home video game console for the international market. Named for its 64-bit central processing unit, it was released in 1996 for the Japanese and North American markets, but unfortunately for Europe, Australia, and France, they had to wait until 1997 to get in on the action. Nintendo ended up partnering with Silicon Graphics, who was the biggest name in computer graphics in the 90s, with their high-end systems being used for movies like Jurassic Park, for example. Nintendo knew with them being on board that this system was going to be in for some power. Codenamed Project Reality, the Nintendo 64 design was mostly complete by mid-1995, but its launch was delayed until 1996 due to manufacturing constraints. They just couldn't keep up with what they thought the demand would end up being, which ended up causing a slowdown. Finally, when it came to launch day, we had 3 games we could enjoy: Super Mario 64, which we all know, and Pilot Wings 64, but I never really got into that one. These were both released worldwide, and then we also had Seikyo Habu Shogi, but this was released only in Japan. But zoning back in here for a second onto Super Mario 64, this game alone went on to sell over 11 million copies during its lifespan, making it Nintendo's best-selling game of the 5th generation. And to just give you an idea on how popular that was at the time, the Nintendo 64 system itself went on to sell about 32 million units worldwide. So that means a little less than half of the owners of the system own the Super Mario 64 cartridge as well.
Actually, the N64 and the Atari Jaguar were the only consoles to still use cartridges this generation.
They were mainly used because cartridges were known to have faster loading times on the console. Also, the usage of the cartridges at the time was considered a prevention from piracy. The only downside was the fact that it cost more to produce the cartridges than it did to produce discs, but Nintendo wanted to give the customer a better experience, so even though the discs would have been cheaper, Nintendo didn't want to sacrifice the quality of games to save a little bit of money. Now, as part of the 5th generation of gaming, the Nintendo 64 competed primarily with the Sony PlayStation, which ended up dominating the market, having sold more than 102 million units during its lifespan, and the Sega Saturn selling about 9 million units during its lifespan. But the Saturn had a huge list of its own flaws that led to its downfall. One of the biggest bugaboos they did was give a surprise announcement about the Saturn's availability during E3 1995, which caught a bunch of retailers off guard, like Walmart for example. These guys literally blurted the release date before telling retailers so they couldn't prepare properly. This pretty much caused a whole wide variety of availability issues, not to mention the Saturn at launch was the most expensive of the 3 consoles, with the N64 going for $199.99, the PlayStation 1 going for $299.99, and then there's the Saturn going for $399.99, which in my opinion makes the N64 look pretty appealing, especially during the holiday season.
Another cool difference that the N64 had was that it chose to use an analog stick as its primary control scheme for interfacing with video games, which makes sense considering how often the D-pad is used.
Intended to provide the user with a wider range of functions such as mobility and camera control, the stick is designed to detect 360 independent directions compared to the 8 independent directions detected by a D-pad, allowing the potential for the Nintendo 64 to more accurately emulate 360 degrees of motion. And we all know that it turned out pretty well for the system, but man, let's talk about how wonky the N64 controllers looked. And this is coming from somebody who loved the system. But honestly, how was this intended to be held? This awkward placement of the D-pad alone made most of the games developed for the system just scrap using the D-pad function altogether. Come to think of it, the only time I ever remember holding the controller like this specifically was for the Ekans minigame in Pokemon Stadium, so shout out to that. But wait, don't forget, we need the analog stick to play the Ekans game, right? But good luck trying to win once the analog stick inevitably comes loose and just kinda hangs there. It's an easy fix, but still a pain that this happens. But despite how the controller looks, we all know the system ended up performing very well. IGN even named it the 9th best console ever back in 2015. But what also helped was having many critically acclaimed games. Games we all know and love, like Super Smash Bros., Zelda, The Ocarina of Time, or Star Fox 64. All of these games gave us great memories and fun moments, and if I'm being honest, I still go back once or twice a year and replay Bomberman Hero. And don't give me that crap that Bomberman 64 was better, because it didn't have a soundtrack that slapped nearly as hard. At the beginning of the 1990s, Nintendo led the video game industry with the original NES. Although the NES follow-up console, the Super NES, was successful, sales ended up taking a hit from a recession going on in Japan called the Lost Decade, but that's a whole nother story on its own. Competition from longtime rival Sega and newcomer Sony emphasized Nintendo's need to develop a successor for the SNES or risk losing market dominance to its competitors, which is exactly how we got this console, and it goes to show that competition is a good thing because it pushes everyone to do better. The only thing complicating matters was that Nintendo also faced a backlash from third-party developers unhappy with Nintendo's strict licensing policies, plus high fees for cartridge manufacturing and dev kits, and a very hard QA process. Now, the Nintendo 64 did have other things going for it that I also loved, like the wide variety of colors and cases. You had your Funtastic consoles, which came in transparent colors like red, blue, green, purple, and so on, but you also had some awesome ones like the blue or orange Pikachu cases, and even one for Pokemon Stadium. Now, you can't just have all these cool looking consoles, but no accessories to go with it, so let's talk about those too. To start off, I think one of the more well-known attachments you can add to this console would be the RAM expansion. This replaces the stock jumper pack and boosts the power of the N64 by giving you an additional whopping 4 megabytes of RAM, making 8 in total. Now, if you've never heard of the expansion pack before, then chances are you may not have owned Donkey Kong 64, Zelda the Majora's Mask, or Perfect Dark on the actual hardware, which all required the expansion pack to run. Other than that, there was really no reason for it and hardly offered any real quality improvement to other games, like Super Mario 64. It won't make you do better on your speedruns. And it actually made games like Space Station Silicon Valley crash from time to time, so hopefully you never threw away your original jumper. Honestly, the real reason they made the expansion pack was for the 64DD, which would allow the N64 to read discs. This was Nintendo's answer to the PlayStation 1, but was ultimately a failure, selling only roughly 15,000 units during its lifespan. This led to other accessories for the N64, like the mouse and keyboard, so you can paint things in Mario Artist, or maybe write an email in between your paint sessions. That sentence alone should explain why the 64DD didn't last long, and this led to some unexpected losses to the future us because we never got to experience some games that were intended to be released on the 64DD, like Super Mario 64 2, Zelda 64, or Kirby 64, just to name a few. Moving on though, one last attachment I'll talk about before wrapping this video up is my personal favorite, the Transfer Pack. This allowed data to be transferred between an N64 game and a Game Boy or Game Boy Color cartridge. Although most of you will probably remember using this attachment with Pokemon Stadium 1 or 2, which allowed you to do all sorts of things like transfer your Pokemon from your Game Boy into Pokemon Stadium. Doing this would let you do a couple of different things like use your Pokemon for mini-games or for battles within Pokemon Stadium. But I think the biggest feature was finally being able to play these games on a bigger, backlit screen. No more need for that stupid worm light. Also, if you're interested, I made a video on how you can turn your Pokemon Game Boy cartridges into working N64 cartridges, but let's get back on topic. Now, while Pokemon was the more popular option to use with the Transfer Pack, it wasn't the only option. Just a few other games that utilized it were Mario Golf, Perfect Dark, and Mario Tennis. These also had cool features that unlock things on the console game, but we'll dive into that another time. Let's start wrapping this up. Nintendo originally wanted the console to be called the Ultra 64, which you can see in some of the chips inside of the console, which may read NUS, which also means Nintendo Ultra 64. The name eventually changed for a few different reasons, but I believe one of them was because Konami owned the copyright of several Ultra-like games, like Ultra Football, for example. But Nintendo states it was simply to keep branding consistent within the Nintendo company. Lastly, the Nintendo 64 was discontinued in 2002, ending its lifespan with a whopping 388 games in its library, including Japanese releases.
For comparison, by the end of the life cycles, the PlayStation 1 had 3,061 games, the SNES and the NES had 1,757 and 716 games respectively.
But the N64 just had a higher number of critically acclaimed games that sold worldwide, with the last game coming out in the system being Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, closing the door on a console that gave us a good decade of great games and great gaming.